Here we're going to be continuing on with American imperialism, specifically looking at the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War actually has its roots with the Cuban Revolution. So back in 1895, we're going to see that Cuban discontent is going to erupt into a revolution on the island. This is going to be led predominantly by Cuban patriot Jose Marti, who's going to launch a revolt against the Spanish, who Cuba was basically a colonial possession of. This is going to be classic guerrilla warfare in this rebellion. The rebels that are the Cubans basically controlled the countryside, whereas the Spanish controlled like the army, and thus controlled like towns and cities. The thing is, the United States is economically interested in Cuba, and we're really concerned about this rebellion because it basically destroyed American property in Cuba and disrupted trade. And so, like, Cleveland's administration during this time period would actually urge Spain to adopt reform because the Spanish were really brutal against the Cubans living on the island, and they had tried to suppress them brutally. And this promoted a lot of American sympathy for these, like, Cuban insurgents. Also, what gained the Cuban insurgents even more sympathy from Americans was the yellow press. When we talk about like fake news today, that concept, this is kind of the fake news, so to speak, of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The yellow press basically included things like really bold headlines, fevered editorials. The thing is, some of the stories in the yellow press were real, but a lot of them were exaggerated. It was anything that might catch someone's attention, catch their eye. Stories about violence, stories about sex, stories about corruption. And so it's through the yellow press that we get journalists insisting that if the United States didn't intervene on behalf of the Cubans, and trying to protect them, protecting the innocent from Spanish lust and cruelty, then if Americans didn't intervene, Americans are considered to be dishonorable and cowardly. We also have to keep in mind, looking at the press at this time period, you have the religious press as well advocating for American intervention, because keep in mind, Spain is predominantly Catholic, and we've seen there's a lot of discrimination against Catholics during this time period in America, and America is predominantly Protestant. So to intervene on behalf of the Cuban insurgents, maybe we could push some Protestant values and everything on them as well. So preachers as well, like, influenced American opinion against Spain. And so what we're seeing basically is over time, more and more Americans are advocating for intervention. And so McKinley, the next president, has a much more expansionist program starting in 1897. And a lot of this is going to start focusing on Cuba. The thing is, McKinley personally did oppose military intervention, especially at first, and really advocated for diplomacy, trying to press Spain to adopt reforms. And basically McKinley's administration is going to warn Spain, hey, if your government doesn't quickly establish peace, then the United States is going to intervene. The thing is, Spain did have some reforms. Starting in about 1897, Spain would modify some of their brutal military tactics and in fact would offer limited autonomy to Cuba. But by that point, Cubans really wanted complete independence, and Spain rejected this. And so relations between Spain and Cuba is deteriorating, and really relationship between Spain and America is deteriorating because of it. And then in 1898, you get what is pictured here. In 1898, the United States battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. This killed 260 American men who were on board. The thing is, the Spanish did not blow up this ship, but individuals like Teddy Roosevelt, who's coming out to be a bigger and bigger politician at this time, blamed the explosion of the battleship Maine on Spanish treachery. It really was some sort of internal accident, basically. A boiler blew up and everything like that. We found this out later, but at the time, basically Americans are going to follow Teddy Roosevelt's lead here and blame this tragedy on the Spanish. And now there's this element of, oh, the Spanish have attacked Americans, and now America has to go to war to kind of uphold its manhood. This is really going to restrict McKinley's options at that point. It pressures him to be a lot more assertive towards Spain, so tension is mounting even more so. And people were really concerned that this tension between Spain and America would hurt America economically, and it could threaten our political interests as well. And we really don't want to come across as weak. So in March of 1898, McKinley is going to send Spain an ultimatum, basically demanding an armistice that would imply Cuban independence. The thing is, Spain is trying to make concessions. They would abolish their reconcentration program and they would declare a unilateral armistice, but this just wasn't enough and it wasn't fast enough. When we sent that ultimatum to Spain, really we had already begun war preparations. McKinley's going to go on to submit a message to Congress asking for authority to use force against Spain, and we will see that Congress declares war on Spain on April 25th of 1898. Now the thing is, when we're looking at this, you might be going, well, are we looking to expand the United States and make an empire? The thing is, most interventionists were not imperialists. And so to prove this, Congress actually added the Teller Amendment to their war resolutions. Basically, this disclaimed any intention of annexing Cuba. It basically is promising Cubans that they would get to govern themselves, that America is going to get involved, but not to take over Cuba. So this is kind of guaranteeing Cuban independence at the end of the war, although there's more of an independence in quotations there, and I'll get to that later. So we can see here on this map how America is getting involved. I'm going to come back to that, but first we have to actually talk about the Philippines, because actually some of the most decisive engagements in the war take place in the Philippines. And you can see on that tiny world map on this picture up front where the Philippines are located versus where Cuba is located. The Philippines were a Spanish colony, and as much as America had promised not to annex Cuba after the war, they made no such promises about the Philippines. So that's the thing is, America is going to use their new Navy here. In May, the United States Navy is going to destroy the weaker Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. It's something like 11 days after America gets involved in this war. They defeat Spanish forces at Manila Bay. So this is going to go really fast. A lot of this is galvanized by expansionist sentiment, because with taking the Philippines, America potentially had a foothold now into Asian markets. I should also mention at this point in time, this precipitates the annexation of Hawaii. So we had all of that drama about should we annex Hawaii, not annex Hawaii, and everything like that. And bam, Spanish-American War happens and we annex Hawaii, because America basically viewed it as an important stepping stone to Manila Bay and Asian markets and the Philippines, and Native Hawaiians protested this annexation, but it happened all the same. When it comes to Cuba, military victory is also going to be pretty swift there as well. It's late in June that the United States Army would land in Cuba. The American Army, quite frankly, was poorly led, trained, and supplied. A lot of the weapons they used in this were old and kind of like left over from the Civil War. And predominantly, Americans' uniforms were wool uniforms. So imagine wearing wool in the tropics. About 2,000 Americans will die of disease in this war, whereas only about 385 were killed in outright battle. We see a lot of the troops that land there are state militias and volunteer units, like the most famous pictured here, the Rough Riders Cavalry Regiment of cowboys and Eastern dandies that were led by Leonard Wood as well as Teddy Roosevelt, and you can even see Teddy Roosevelt in that picture. The Rough Riders gained a lot of public attention, but actually one of the groups that did the most for America in this was actually the 10th Negro Cavalry, which played a really crucial role in capturing San Juan Hill. Unfortunately, afterwards, basically the Rough Riders got all of the credit. It's not even just the land troops that do well. America's naval power is also very decisive. We see the Spanish squadron in Cuba destroyed very quickly, and this basically isolates the Spanish army in Cuba, which guaranteed its defeat. We also see the United States would go on to do things like seize Puerto Rico without any serious opposition. And very shortly after, Spain is going to sign an armistice ending the war on August 12th. And so Americans are basically delighted with all of the military achievements they have gained through the Spanish-American War. Which leads us to the Treaty of Paris. This is specifically the Treaty of Paris made in 1898. By the way, if you Google Treaty of Paris, there's a million of them, so make sure that you're like making note of those dates and such. This armistice, we are going to see Spain is going to accept Cuban independence. So Cuba is now independent, although I'll get more into some of the issues of that later. Spain is also going to cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. So this is how the United States gets those territories. And they're going to allow the United States to continue to occupy Manila Bay in the Philippines. This is where there's a big issue of what to do with the Philippines. There was, in the end, I should go ahead and say, Spain is going to end up ceding the Philippines to the United States, and the Philippines are going to become a territory of the United States. It's just more complicated because the Philippines really wanted to be independent. And I'm going to get more into that in a second, but I want to talk more about how the United States took the Philippines and what reasons they took the Philippines for. Basically, McKinley is going to state like there's religious reasons as well as American values and wanting to spread those values to the Philippines. But really, a lot of this is for political reasons and to commercially get America a foothold into Asian markets. There's also this concern that if America didn't take the Philippines, then like Japan or Germany might try to seize them. We're going to get the final terms of peace in December of 1898. And like I said, Spain will agree to cede the Philippines to the United States despite the Filipino demands for independence. This is also going to be really complicated because there's a lot of Americans that actually did not want America to take the Philippines. There's a lot of anti-imperialists, such as the Anti-Imperialist League, that felt like America acquiring overseas colonies really conflicted with the nation's commitment to liberty and our claim to like moral superiority, pointing out the irony of America owning their own colonies when they had once been a colony. A lot of the reasoning for taking the Philippines was on a racist basis of, oh, it's the white man's burden. We have to, help modernize their economy to match ours and so on and so forth. So those against imperialism were oftentimes like African Americans who derided the rhetoric of the Anglo-Saxon superiority that underlaid a lot of imperialism. And so we actually see African Americans organizing the Black Man's Burden Association, and they specifically promoted Filipino independence. Now, other arguments against taking the Philippines were a bit less high-minded. Ironically, you also have racists who were against Americans taking the Philippines because they felt like the Filipino people were just inferior and they would never be able to assimilate. So we shouldn't take them because we don't want them. So ironically, yeah, you have both sides being against imperialism there a little bit. The debate over this treaty became bitter. So as much as like all of the final terms are decided in December, it's not until February 6th of 1899 that the Senate actually narrowly ratifies the treaty and the United States would keep the islands for the time being. This is such a decisive issue that actually William Jennings Bryan, who tried to run for election, the president in 1900, he's going to run partly on the concept of freeing the Philippines if the Democrats won. But prosperity basically during McKinley's term is going to help re-elect him. So, thinking about all the reasons for imperialism, I'm going to read a source on the next slide, and I want you to explain how this source supports one of those reasons for imperialism that has been previously stated. So this is William McKinley talking about his decision to take the Philippines. He says, "When I next realized that the Philippines had dropped into our laps, I confess I did not know what to do with them. I sought counsel from all sides, Democrats as well as Republicans, but got little help. I thought first we would take only Manila, then Luzon, then the islands perhaps too. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed to Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night. And one night, late it came to me this way. I don't know how it was, but it came. One, that we could not give them back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. Two, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business and discreditable. Three, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was. And four, that there was nothing left for us to do but take them all, and to education and the Filipinos, and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, by God's grace do very best we could by them, as our fellow men, for whom Christ also died. And then I went to bed, and went to sleep, and slept soundly. And the next morning I sent for the chief engineer of the War Department, our map maker, and told him to put the Philippines on the map of the United States, pointing to a large map on the wall of his office. And there they are, and there they will stay while I am president."